Hello and welcome to digi8.com. In this video, we are going to cover the topic on empathy mapping. Now let's start with the definition of empathy mapping. One of the synergic tools that can be utilized to acquire better insight into consumers is an empathy map. Similar to a user persona, a set of users like segmentation of customers can be represented through an empathy map. Dave Gray was a creator of the empathy map, which is notably renowned in the nimble community. Moving on to empathy mapping format. Conventional empathy maps are composed of 4 quartiles, that is, says, thinks, does, and feels. The user persona in these maps is placed in the middle. Let's look at these quartiles briefly. First, says. This quartile either consists of what is said by the user during an interview or other studies based on usability. Next, thinks. This quartile consists of the thoughts of the user all through the experience. Using qualitative research that is collected, specific questions must be answered. These questions help understand the thoughts of a user, what the user is thinking, what is essential to the user, whether what the user is saying and thinking can be the same. The most important part is to consider things that the user might think but is unwilling to say. Next, does. The user's actions make up the does quartile. From the collected qualitative research, the user's actions, the methodology followed by them must be figured out. And finally, feels. The emotional connection of the user forms the feels quartile. This is generally denoted by an adjective followed by a brief description of the context. Users' worries and interests must be figured out through the gathered research, along with how they emotionally feel about the events. Please note, sometimes the quartiles may overlap or seem obscure. Moving on to empathy mapping's revised format. The new model. The earlier discussed empathy map is beneficial for initial evaluation. However, its universal nature makes it unsuitable for user experience design-based brainstorming settings. Paul Borg suggested a format of empathy maps that are beneficial for product design in order to make it user interface design specific. And these include the following. First, feelings. What is important to the user and how the user feels emotionally concerning the experience. Next, task. The task that the user attempts to finish. Third, influences. The influence of place, things or people over the actions of the user. Pain points. The pain points that the user might be undergoing that they wish to get over. The anxieties, frustrations, and the fears of the user. And finally, goals. The final goal of the user and what they attempt to attain. One's knowledge of a persona can be visualized in an orderly fashion through empathy maps. Third, when to use an empathy map. In circumstances where a company needs to plunge into the environment of its customers, empathy maps may be used. These can be beneficial for companies. Moving further, it includes plunging into a business customer segments. Next, development of user persona. Next, while interviewing customers, recording their behavior. Fourth, in a user story, that is adding or developing a user. Next, understanding and classifying qualitative research. And finally, individuals may identify the gaps in their present day knowledge. Moving on, the empathy mapping process of how to build an empathy map. First, establish goals and scope. Second, assemble all the materials. Third, gather research. Fourth, sticky notes to be created for each quartile individually as we discussed earlier. Fifth, connect to a group and incorporate. And finally, plan and refine. Moving on to empathy mapping and user personas. The concept of user personas and empathy maps are closely related. Empathy maps are generally the base of a user persona. Broad information collected about users can then be moved to the personas model. The end user, as in the real individual, with human attributes like age, motivation, traits, personality, and name must be represented through the process. Finally, empathy mapping basics. First, divide the consumers. Divide the consumers into unique parts depending on their persona and demographics. After the division is done, the 3 most profitable segments must be prioritized. Next, make the divisions humane. Segments must be mentally turned into relatable and real people after the identification of the 3 divisions. Ways to do this including creating the idea of a whole person using details like income, education, age, etc. and giving them fake names. Identifying with the division becomes simpler with this representation of a person. Next, understand your divisions. Representation of a person from each division in a team must be placed on the empathy map. Following this, questions must be asked that are to be answered from the perspective of the representative. And finally, confirm the validity of the empathy map. After mapping this broad list, validating it with original customer responses is mandatory. A sample group of consumers from the division can be asked these questions. Their answers can be used to validate the empathy map. So that's it, folks. This brings an end to the topic on empathy mapping. These are some of the sources and links referred to for the content in the video.
Thank you and see you in the next video.